Thank you all for your attention this morning. Like Valeska said, my name's Tim Ryan. I'm based in Singapore, and I work within MLA's Trade and Market Access team. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all the best with your networking today, and I hope 2020 ends up to be a little bit less disruptive from what much of the year has been like for most of the industry. This morning, I want to provide an update on the Australian red meat supply and outlook, and also give you an update on some global trade trends that we've seen. So firstly, I'll provide a bit of an update on supply conditions in Australia, and particularly the last couple of years have been quite extreme to some extent. And I'll give you an update on what the forecast is based off these conditions. I'll also look at some Australian export trends and shifting global demand and how these two are influencing one another. And then I'll focus in a bit more detail on some trends that we've seen in Southeast Asia. But firstly, looking at supply trends, and the last 2 years, if you've seen any media out of Australia, have been very extreme, to say the least. 2019 started with extreme flooding in northern Queensland. Then key livestock producing regions entered their second year of drought in 2019. And 2019 finished with fairly severe bushfires down the eastern seaboard, which amongst all this was a very challenging environment for Australian producers. Fortunately, however, conditions have improved vastly so far this year. In southern Australia, the wetter months of the year, which is usually over winter and spring, have been very favourable to pasture growth. And the outlook for the northern wet season this summer is also very favourable as well. So conditions have improved vastly over the last 9 months or so compared to what we had in 2019. And while the floods and fires were extreme and very distressing for certain producers, it's really this cycle of drought and the recovery from drought that's driven national supply of beef and sheep meat over the last couple of years and influenced national pricing mostly. So if we look at how these trends have influenced the Australian and cattle and sheep supply, here we have the Australian national cattle herd in red on the left-hand side and the Australian sheep flock in green on the right-hand side. And you see a bit of volatility there, and most of those peaks and troughs coincide with a drought event. And you can see that happening in the last couple of years. In 2019 and 2018, much of Australia's key livestock producing regions faced drought, and so producers had to turn off excess numbers of livestock. So ultimately, this year, we had a bit of a shortage of livestock, but fortunately, given the current conditions and looking ahead over the next few years, we're expecting those stock conditions to recover as producers rebuild and have the incentive there because they've got available pasture and prices are quite favourable. So longer term, we are expecting more numbers of livestock. This will translate into increased beef and sheep meat production in the longer term. However, as we go through this rebuild phase, it does mean there could be continuation of supply shortages relative to what we've seen in the last couple of years. And while we've seen the influence of drought on Australia's supply, we have seen some disruption from COVID-19 this year. However, while we've had this disruption, the supply chains proved relatively resilient. But we have seen ongoing disruption and shortages of reefer containers around the world, particularly as China went into lockdown. A lot of containers were stuck in the country. But we've also seen disruption coming from changing shipping schedules as countries come in and out of lockdown. And also Australia's faced some industrial action through its eastern states ports, which has also added a bit of disruption to the mix as well. On top of that, we've seen some shortages of air freight capacity out of Australia as passenger liners have been grounded. About 5% of Australia's beef and sheep meat exports goes out via the belly of an aeroplane. So when we have fewer aircraft in the sky, this channel for export does become more difficult. However, in key air freight markets in Southeast Asia like Singapore, volumes have remained relatively high, even despite this overall shortage of capacity. And thirdly, we've seen some disruption to primary processing. This has been nowhere near the same magnitude as we've seen in North America or Europe, but as some states have seen increasing cases of COVID-19, particularly Victoria, we have seen some impact to primary processing. However, as a whole, none of these forces or sources of disruption have had an overbearing impact on supply. And it's really those drought conditions and the recovery from drought that's been the overwhelming factor in 2020. So looking at beef production in the last couple of years and the forecast, you can see there in 2018 and 19, beef production did spike, and that was really driven by those drought conditions and producers turning off elevated numbers of livestock. But for beef production this year, we're expecting about a 15% year-on-year decline, which mostly reflects that turnaround in seasonal conditions. We're expecting a modest increase next year, but a greater increase in the years after. So that's beef production. If we look at beef exports, it's a similar chart and similar trend. Australia exports about 70% of its beef production or 75% of its beef production. So large changes in what we produce translate into large changes in what we export. And you can see there, there's a fairly sizable drop this year, and most of that's happened in the second half of the year. That said, while it's a fairly large decline, we are expecting it to recover. And even a decline of this magnitude, we're still exporting above 1 million tonnes of product, which is a volume we'd never done prior to 2013. So historically, they're still quite high volumes. We can look at some similar charts in terms of sheep meat production as well. And here we can see Australian lamb production in green on the left-hand side. And there's been a fairly consistent long-term increase in that production trend, but there are some peaks and troughs coinciding with that drought cycle. So this year we are expecting the year to finish a bit lower than 2019. But most of that decline has already happened with disruption and shortages around April and May, and volumes more recently returning to fairly normal levels. And long term, we are expecting that recovery to continue and to reach record levels in coming years. It's a bit of a different story when it comes to mutton production, however. So this is the older animal coming through, and this is far more sensitive to changes in the national sheep flock. So as we rebuild those national flock numbers, this does mean that there's fewer sheep coming through to be turned off. And over the coming years, we are expecting a bit of a shortage of mutton production to be maintained. However, also being offset by that increase in lamb production. And similarly, we can also look at the impact on exports as well. In short, similar trends as production, we are expecting record levels to return in 2021. But you can see there that those mutton export volumes probably aren't going to reach levels that we saw last year for a number of years yet. So there's some conditions that we've seen from a supply perspective and a forecast. I think at the moment we are experiencing relatively tight supplies, particularly on beef, but we are expecting those to recover, particularly from next year, but also longer term as well, as that herd and flock does begin to rebuild after the drought. So with that, I'd like to now shift to Australian exports and look at shifting global demand for that product. Just honing in firstly on monthly beef export volumes. So on the left-hand side is the total tonnage, and on the right-hand side is the year-on-year change. And firstly, I'll just cast your attention to the first half of 2020, so the grey bars there. And by and large, exports were tracking fairly typically of what we'd expect for that time of year. We saw very little disruption from COVID-19 actually translating into reduced exports. But if you then shift to the second half of the year, we do begin to see some of those cattle shortages translate into reduced export volumes, and that reduction really peaked in September. A couple of things to note, however, we are comparing 2020 volumes to what was a very high 2019 and also 2018 in the second half of the year. But overall, we have seen a tightening of supply in recent months. We can look at a very similar chart for Lam Exports. And it's a bit of a different story in this case. Earlier this year, we did see some tighter months in terms of overall supply and how this impacted exports. And you can see in April and May in both charts that there was a fairly sizable reduction year on year. This wasn't necessarily related to COVID-19. It was just the flow through of product that had come through from 2019's lamb crop. But in more recent months, we have seen those supply conditions return and exports normalise, and we should expect that in months ahead as well. However, mutton's quite a contrasting story, and this has been one of fairly tight supplies throughout 2020. Really, from February on, we've seen year-on-year declines in overall exports. And given the outlook, we are expecting relatively tight supplies of mutton in 2021 as well. So that's very much looking at the short-term drivers. We can take a step back and also look at some of those longer-term export trends as well, and look at where Australian red meat is shifting between around the world. So this first chart here on the left-hand side looks at the Australian export or beef export share between our major export regions. And there's a few key trends to note, but the big shift really has been this continuing shift into Asian markets. In the early to mid-2000s, we saw the huge growth in the likes of Japan and Korea when the US was locked out due to BSE. But then we've seen the increase in Southeast Asia on the bottom there, and more recently the huge growth in the likes of China. But overall, we've seen this general gradual shift into Asia. We can look at a similar chart for sheep meat as well. And you can see some similar trends there. Southeast Asia has grown, but far more gradually than what we've seen in beef. But we've seen this huge increase in China's share of our sheep meat exports as well. Taking an even bigger step backwards, we can also look at the global meat trade now. And this chart on the left-hand side looks at all the major meat exporters across all the major meat products, from poultry through to beef, through to offal and sheep meat. And this is looking at what's being recorded on an export basis. And I think this is important because at the start of 2020, there was a lot of concern about how supply chains would hold up, and particularly around food security and our ability to meet demand for countries that rely on imports. So this chart here looks at the average growth rate in the last 5 years there at 2.1%. And we can compare that to what we've seen in 2020. So in actual fact, not only has the industry as a whole managed to overcome the disruption from COVID-19, we've actually grown at a far greater rate than what we have seen in the last few years to record volumes of product being exported around the world. So I think this is a real positive. But a key driver of that growth has been China. So this chart on the right-hand side looks at that same data, but pulls out the overall volumes going to China in grey there at the top. So if we ignore China, overall meat trade has declined a little bit in 2020, and this really reflects a lot more the disruption to demand of COVID-19. But you can see that wedge attributed to China in grey steadily increasing over the last decade, and that's really being underpinned by that growing affluent consumer class. But in 2020, it's been supercharged by two other forces. One, China was one of the countries to really rebound from COVID-19 far quicker than the rest of the world. So demand there has normalised far more than most other countries. But two, we've seen the huge influence of of African swine fever on that demand for Chinese meat imports, and it really reflects China's ability to strip product away from some other markets. So looking at that huge driver of global trade, African swine fever in China, we can see the decline on the left-hand side in pork production between 2018 and 2020. And these figures are forecast by the USDA. However, there are signs that China's pork production is recovering. So some figures indicate that in Q4 this year, China's pork production would be greater year on year. And we have also seen a softening of China's domestic pork prices, which indicates a bit of a recovery. So really getting a grasp on how quickly that pork production will recover and to what magnitude will have a huge influence on global meat trade in coming years. And just to put that into a bit of perspective, on the right-hand side, we have monthly Chinese meat imports of all products going into that country. And you can see the huge shift between 2018 and 2020. It was typically importing about 300,000 to 400,000 tonnes of product per month. That's increased this year to about 800,000 to 1 million tonnes per month. So a lot of product is being displaced by African swine fever. But as that also recedes, this product may be shifting into other markets as well, which we need to be mindful of. The other source of disruption this year, and also which will ripple for years to come, will be COVID-19. So it's had a huge impact on economies around the world. They've all responded in different ways, but by and large, with the exception of China, most countries have recorded a fairly sizable contraction this year. And on the left-hand side, we've got the IMF's October outlook. Fortunately, most economies are forecast to recover in 2021. And even just this morning, I've seen that there's a third vaccine being readied for the market, which really favours that recovery. But we need to be mindful that not all these markets will recover in the same way, and some will be faster and some will be slower than others, which we need to be ready to respond to. The other major area where COVID-19 has impacted the meat industry has really been through the food service channel. So we estimate that about 2/3 of Australia's red meat that is consumed globally would be typically or traditionally consumed through a food service channel. So when we have a shutdown or a slowdown in that channel, it does create a lot of disruption and challenges in pivoting towards retail or e-commerce. So this chart on the right-hand side looks at food service traffic through a number of markets. Unfortunately, I don't have any for Southeast Asia in this series, and it's really focused on North America and Europe. But some of these trends do apply to all markets around the world. So firstly, you can see the huge slowdown in food service as countries went into that first stage lockdown. And as they've come out of that, we have seen varying degrees of recovery between markets. Critically, I think more recently, however, we've seen even greater divergence in that recovery. So if you look at somewhere like Australia, food service is going fairly well. But if you look at the likes of Europe, they're largely going back into lockdown. So I think that's something we can expect until we have a widespread vaccine on the market, that we will continue to see this on-off type of economy, and also a lot of divergent and variation between markets as well. So when we're looking at a lot of divergent trends in different markets around the world, either coming from changing trade flows driven by ASF, as economies recover, or as economies go in and out of lockdown, we do need to be able to respond to that demand as it turns on and off. And fortunately for Australia, we've got very favourable market access. So this map of the world looks at the average tariff rate applied to Australian beef and sheep meat. And you can see in many of our key markets, Australian tariffs applied to Australian product is relatively low. And particularly in Southeast Asia, we now face very few tariffs. and this has even improved in 2020 with the Indonesia-Australia FTA coming through, and also the removal of tariffs into Thailand for Australian beef. So this has all been very favourable. So as demand does recover, we are able to respond to that. That said, this isn't the only indication of how we can trade. Non-tariff barriers still remain a fairly sizable challenge in some of these export markets. So lastly, I'll just turn to some more regional trends that we've seen in Southeast Asia in terms of trade flows. Just put this into a bit of perspective. Firstly, here we've got the combination of Australian red meat and livestock exports coming out of Australia into Southeast Asia, and this is on a value basis. So last year, or last year ending June, exports were valued at about just under 3 billion Australian dollars. Live exports, or live cattle specifically, accounted for about 45% of that, but we have seen this growing share in terms of beef and sheep meat exports as well. And while live cattle is very important for the region, for the rest of this presentation, I'm really going to focus on the beef and sheep meat trade. So how has Southeast Asia fared in terms of beef exports compared to our other major export markets? This is a chart looking at our major export regions around the world and various trends across those. You can see there in the middle, Southeast Asia, it's fared relatively well. While clearly having a lot of challenges, its exports have held up relatively well compared to the likes of North Asia or even the United States. Looking specifically at markets across the region, though, there is a bit of divergence in how some markets have performed compared to others. If you look at Indonesia and the Philippines, we have seen a decline year on year, particularly in terms of the commodity product going into these markets, which I'll touch on in a bit more detail shortly. That's really driven those declines. But if you look at some of the other markets, particularly the emerging ones of Thailand or Vietnam, they've performed relatively well, and Singapore's done very well, while Malaysia has been fairly steady year on year. So if we're looking at around the world, most markets have declined year on year, and that's really driven by those supply shortages, particularly in the second half of 2020. But in actual fact, Southeast Asia is one of the few regions where we have seen some growth in some markets, with the likes of Thailand or Singapore expanding year on year so far. So just touching on those supply conditions out of Australia and how that's influencing the makeup of Australian beef exports. On the left-hand side, we've got Australian beef exports broken up across three main categories. In blue, you've got manufacturing beef, which is predominantly trim product, and then you've got grain-fed and grass-fed primals. And I'll show you just a few trends that are of interesting to note. So I talked earlier about this shift between drought and the recovery from drought as we see some improved seasonal conditions. And we saw a similar scenario play out in 2014 and 15 when we had drought, and then the recovery take place in 2016 and 2017. We're now on the edge of a similar transition between drought and improved seasonal conditions. And what we typically see during these periods is relatively tighter supply of trim and grass-fed product, while grain-fed product down the bottom there has held up pretty well, and in fact has typically continued to steadily rise over the last decade. We can then also compare similar trends with what we've seen in Southeast Asia over the last couple of decades, and particularly in 2020. We've seen some influence of the drought conditions and the relatively tighter supplies of grass-fed and manufacturing product, but overall the market has held up fairly well in 2020. We've seen a bit of a decline in grass and trim, but really that decline hasn't been to the same magnitude as we've seen at a national level, and that really reflects the strong underlying demand across the region. So looking at that breakdown of various products coming into Southeast Asia, it's relatively well balanced in terms of what we produce off every carcass is fairly well represented with what we send into Southeast Asia, with a large portion of manufacturing forequarter and hindquarter primals, as well as full sets, carcasses, and loin cuts as well. However, if we look at then specific markets across the region, we see a lot more variation. So the likes of Singapore, Vietnam, and Thailand take a lot more primal cuts, while Indonesia and the Philippines takes a lot more manufacturing product. And if we look at Indonesia and the Philippines and that reliance on the manufacturing side, that's where we have seen some declines in trade, particularly in the last few months, due to those underlying supply shifts that we've seen out of Australia. But we also want to look at the premium end of the market and look at the chilled trade into the region. I think we can see some really positive trends here. So even despite the disruption that we've seen to channels and demand this year, we have seen some strong growth in chilled trade. And most major markets have recorded an increase in chilled beef exports. So Singapore has steadily risen, and that's a continuation of a fairly sustained trend. But Thailand and Vietnam have recorded really strong growth in chilled trade this year. Indonesia is the main exception to this, but that's really being driven by the reduced availability of air freight and a large or a decent size of that trade, typically relying on flights coming out of Australia into Jakarta. So we have seen a bit of a decline there as well. But overall, I think this is a real positive for the region. Just looking at the region more broadly and the overall volume of product entering the market. Here we've got a chart looking at all the major beef suppliers around the world exporting product into Southeast Asia. And you can see Indian buffalo coming in there in green, and a large part of that does go to Vietnam, and some of that does end up in the likes of China. But overall, we can see product coming into the region, and in the last few years, it's typically hovered around that 1.2 million tonne mark. However, we have seen a bit of a shift in 2020, and that's really that coming from that Indian buffalo meat, and India experiencing a fairly severe lockdown earlier this year, and that having a very severe impact on monthly volumes coming out of India. So that's really created a shortage of commodity product in the region, which has supported some products out of the likes of Australia and also other suppliers. But really, Australia, in many respects, doesn't necessarily compete head-to-head with India. So this chart on the right-hand side is the exact same data. We've just pulled Indian buffalo away. So this is really looking at the medium to high-end quality product entering the market. So firstly, you can see over the long term, there has been fairly strong growth in product out of Australia, but also there's a lot more other suppliers on the market as well, with the likes of Brazil and even the US in the last few years increasing their presence. So there is more competition out there on the market. However, the market is still growing. So lastly, I'll just touch on sheep meat export trends globally and into Southeast Asia. So on the left-hand side, you can see Australian exports into our major regions. The main three are China, North America, and the Middle East. But you can also see Southeast Asia there in fourth place. And compared to the likes of the Middle East and China, Southeast Asia has held up fairly well this year. It has had some supply challenges, particularly relying on a large portion of mutton, which has been tight. But overall, it's been able to overcome those and still maintain volumes. Looking across the region now at sheep meat export trends in specific markets, we can see Malaysia and Singapore doing quite well throughout this disruption. They do rely on mutton, but there has been an ability to switch to increased lamb product. Some of our more emerging sheep meat markets, such as Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, have faced more disruption. These emerging markets with consumers new to sheep meat do rely on food service channels, which have been particularly affected this year. So it's no surprise that lamb to those markets has declined, as consumers aren't really able or willing to shift that product or consumption into retail channels. So overall, I think the sheep meat story this year has been quite favourable. We can also look at the product and cut mix of sheep meat into the likes of Malaysia and Singapore. So clearly, both markets rely heavily on mutton, but as I mentioned, with mutton in relative tight supply and lamb more available, we have seen increased trade in lamb products. So the likes of Malaysia has seen a shift from mutton shoulder into lamb shoulder, and we have seen a shift in Singapore from the likes of mutton legs into lamb legs. So there has been that ability to move product between those two major categories. So that's the end of my presentation. I think, in summary, I think the outlook is fairly positive. There's some clear challenges facing us on a range of fronts, but I think underlying conditions for future demand growth are strong. In terms of supply, we have seen some challenges this year coming out of drought, but I think the long-term outlook is fairly favourable. We have seen a shift in Australian exports over the last couple of decades, but that shift is increasingly into Asia, and we have seen overall growth into the likes of Southeast Asia. In terms of Southeast Asia this year, I think there's been some fairly favourable trends. There's a lot of disruption around the world at the moment stemming from COVID-19, but overall, compared to some of our other markets, volumes into Southeast Asia have remained fairly strong. So that's all from me. Valeska, I'll hand it back over to you. Thank you.